I remember that night as if it were yesterday. The computer clock showed 8:47 p.m. when I closed the last spreadsheet of the day. It was supposed to be an ordinary day at the office, but something in the air felt different. The empty building, with its flickering lights and silent corridors, made everything a bit stranger. I was used to being the last one to leave, always stuck at work, but that day the feeling of exhaustion felt heavier than usual, as if something was hovering over me. I grabbed my backpack, turned off the lights in the small office where I worked, and headed to the parking lot. The cold night breeze, typical of a small town, hit me as soon as I stepped outside the building. I sighed, just wanting to be home, lying on the couch, maybe with a cold beer in hand. It was a relief to think about that. I opened the car door and started the engine. The familiarity of the routine calmed me, and the sound of the engine, which I knew so well, felt like a small comfort after a stressful day. The radio automatically tuned to a local station, and a board announcer was talking about the weather. Clear skies, no rain in the forecast. At least that, I thought. But when I checked the GPS, I saw what awaited me. The usual route, the main road, was marked by an unexpected traffic jam. I sighed again, frustrated. I didn't have the patience to face another hour in traffic. Then something crossed my mind. Old Cross Road. I hesitated for a moment. That rural road was known for its stories. Ghost tales, mysterious apparitions, and that tragic accident a few years ago. Not that I believed in that kind of thing, of course. I'd always been a skeptic, someone with my feet firmly planted in reality. People love to exaggerate when it comes to the supernatural, and I had neither the time nor the patience for such nonsense. But the exhaustion spoke louder. The shortcut would save me a good few minutes, maybe half an hour, and I needed to get home quickly. A voice in the back of my mind told me not to go, but I ignored it. As I drove toward the entrance of Old Cross Road, the surroundings began to change. The city lights dimmed, and the small, scattered houses gave way to vast, dark fields. The moon, already high in the sky, cast long shadows on the road. The silence outside felt different, oppressive in a way, as if nature itself were holding its breath. Finally, I turned right, entering the road that cut through the darkness. The uneven asphalt groaned under the car tires, and the trees along the way seemed to draw closer, as if forming a tunnel. Narrow and almost deserted, the road was known for its abandonment. Few ventured there, and now I was starting to understand why. As I drove, the radio began to fail. Static and crackling noises took over the station. A wave of irritation swept through me as I tried to tune in something worth listening to, but the noise only got worse. With no options, I turned off the radio and silence filled the car. That's when I felt it, for the first time that night, a slight discomfort. Old Cross Road seemed more isolated than I remembered. It was as if time had stopped, as if that road were separated from the world. I knew it was only a 15-minute drive to the end, but that night, something made me doubt whether I'd really make it out the other side. I didn't believe in ghosts. At least that's what I told myself. As I drove through the darkness of Old Cross Road, I couldn't help but remember the stories about that road. I'd never paid much attention to those things. I always preferred to believe in facts, in logic. But there was one story that bothered me more than the others, one I'd heard years ago, and, despite being absurd, it always made me uncomfortable whenever I remembered it. It was the story of Marcus O'Neill, a young man from the neighboring town, always told with exaggeration by the older residents. They said he was the kind of guy who feared nothing. When people talked about deserted roads and the mysteries surrounding them, Marcus would always laugh. He was the guy who would drive down any road, regardless of the time or the legends surrounding it. And that's exactly why he accepted the challenge to cross Old Cross Road alone on a winter's night, something, according to legend, no one dared do. The story went that it was an especially cold and silent night. The sky was cloudy, and the wind cut through the skin like blades. Marcus was returning from a party in a nearby town, somewhat drunk and full of bravado. His friends, trying to scare him, bet that he wouldn't have the guts to take the most feared road in the region, the very one where several people had reported seeing things. Of course, Marcus accepted the bet with a smile on his face. He entered the road laughing, not believing any of the stories. He thought it was all just talk to scare the faint-hearted. The first few curves were easy. He drove calmly, the radio playing some old song, and the alcohol still clouding his mind. But as he advanced, the atmosphere began to change. The air inside the car seemed heavier, denser, as if the engine's warmth was being sucked out, leaving the interior colder and colder. He later told his friends that at a certain point the radio began to fail. First, the music sounded distorted, as if being played underwater. Then the static took over. When he tried to adjust it, he realized the dial wasn't responding. The radio simply died. With no music, silence filled the car, except for the sound of the tires on the asphalt. That's when something began to bother him. At first, it was the sensation that he wasn't alone in the car anymore. It was absurd, of course. He was alone, that much was obvious. But the feeling persisted, as if someone were sitting in the back seat, watching him. He glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the emptiness of the leather seat. But for a split second, he thought he saw something. A shadow. Something that shouldn't have been there. Whatever it was, it disappeared the moment he focused his eyes. But Marcus's heart began to race. He laughed, trying to calm himself, convinced that it was just the alcohol and fatigue playing tricks on him. He kept driving, now a little more alert, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. Things got worse when he reached a long straight stretch of road. It was the part where the trees on both sides formed a dark tunnel, one of the most isolated points. It was there that he swore with all conviction that he saw a figure walking in the middle of the road. At first, it seemed distant, just a blur in the darkness. But as the car approached, the figure began to take shape. It was a woman. She was standing in the middle of the road, completely still. The car's headlights illuminated her white, stained dress, which seemed to sway in the wind. Even though there was no breeze that night, Marcus slowed down, finding the situation strange, but he didn't stop. He tried to swerve around her, but the closer he got, the more the figure seemed to stay at the exact same distance, always in the center of the road. No matter how fast or slow the car went, she wouldn't move. He said that, in a moment of pure desperation, he floored the gas, determined to drive straight through her if necessary. The speedometer climbed, the engine roared, but the woman stayed right there. When the car was about to hit her, in the blink of an eye, she disappeared. There was no sound, no collision. She simply vanished into thin air, as if she had never been there. Marcus almost lost control of the car but managed to stay on the road. His breathing was heavy, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked in the rearview mirror, and that's when the worst part happened. In the reflection of the mirror, he saw her again. Not on the road, but inside the car in the back seat. The woman was sitting there, her face hidden by her hair, leaning forward as if to look closely at him. Marcus said that, for a second, his body froze with fear. He couldn't scream, he couldn't move. The only thing he managed to do was slam on the brakes with all his strength, and the car skidded, stopping abruptly on the shoulder. He spun around in his seat, expecting to see that figure, but the back seat was empty. She had disappeared. After that night, Marcus never spoke of what happened again. Some friends said he had become paranoid, others that he made up the story for attention. But there was something different about him afterward. That shine of confidence was gone. He refused to take any isolated road at night, especially Old Cross Road. And me, I didn't believe in ghosts. But as I drove down that same road, on that lonely night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I had been immersed in that darkness for a good few minutes, trying not to think too much about the stories of the road when something ahead caught my attention. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the road, almost imperceptible, partially wrapped in the shadows of the trees. My heart raced. For a moment, I thought it was some animal, maybe a deer or something. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A young woman was standing there, her arms hanging by her sides, her disheveled hair falling over her shoulders. She was wearing something light-colored, which made it easier to see her in the yellowish glow of my headlights. It was impossible to ignore what this meant. On such an isolated road, late at night, no one should be there. My initial instinct was to keep driving. Just step on the gas and go. But something made me slow down. Maybe it was her expression. Even from a distance, the way she stood so still, her head down, her fragile silhouette, everything seemed off. It wasn't normal. She seemed lost. I sighed, trying to push away the growing unease. I slowed the car until I came to a stop beside her, the engine still rumbling softly. For a moment, I hesitated before rolling down the window. The cold night air entered the car, carrying a strange, almost oppressive silence. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice sounding weaker than I had expected. The young woman slowly raised her head. Her eyes were light, almost glowing under the headlights, but there was something empty in her gaze. She stared at me for a few seconds without answering, only increasing the tension in my chest. I was about to drive away when I finally heard her voice, soft, almost a whisper. "I'm lost. Can I get a ride?" My whole body tensed. This felt like a bad idea. Old Cross Road, a girl alone in the middle of the night. Everything screamed danger. But at the same time, the idea of leaving her there, alone, in the cold, bothered me even more. There was something about her, something that made me feel that if I left, something worse would happen. Against all my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door. "Sure, get in." She didn't smile or thank me right away. She just slowly walked to the door and got in the car with delicate movements, almost as if she were dragging herself. When she closed the door, the air inside the car felt heavier, as if I had invited something in that shouldn't be there. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to break the strange silence that had formed. She looked straight ahead, as if concentrating on the empty horizon, and replied, "Emily. Emily Thompson." The name sounded familiar, but I didn't have time to process it. The discomfort I felt upon hearing her voice was almost physical, a strange sensation that settled in my stomach. It wasn't just the fact that I had picked up a stranger on the road. It was something about her that felt out of place. "Where are you going, Emily?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "Not far. Just take me to the next intersection." Her eyes finally met mine again, and something in those eyes unsettled me. There was a mix of sadness and exhaustion, but also something indefinable, something that made me want to look away. As much as I didn't want to admit it, the atmosphere in the car had completely changed. The tension was there, hanging like an invisible weight. "Okay, I'll drop you off there," I muttered, starting the engine and pulling back onto the road. As we drove, the silence between us seemed to deepen. I could hear my own breathing, the sound of the engine, and the tires on the asphalt. Emily remained still in her seat, her hands resting in her lap, not looking at me or out the windows. It was as if she were focused on something only she could see, something beyond what was there. I glanced slightly in her direction, but the faint light from the dashboard only accentuated her pale features. What bothered me wasn't just the fact that she was there. It was the way she was, as if she didn't fully belong to that moment. As if her presence wasn't real. I tried to shake off these thoughts. You're just tired, I thought. You're letting the stories you've heard get to you. But the more I tried to convince myself of that, the harder it became to ignore the growing discomfort. After a few minutes of silence, I decided to try once again to break the tension. What were you doing out here so late? I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. She took a long time to answer, but when she finally spoke, her voice was distant, almost as if she were recalling something she'd rather forget. I was waiting for someone, but I don't think that person is coming back. A chill ran down my spine. There was something strange about the way she said that, as if there was more to the sentence than I could understand. The feeling of discomfort intensified, and I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake in letting her into the car. Something wasn't right. The car continued moving forward, the monotonous sound of the tires on the asphalt breaking the oppressive silence between us. I tried to focus only on the road, on the dark curves stretching out before me, but I couldn't help glancing over at the girl sitting next to me. Emily seemed even paler under the faint light of the dashboard, almost as if she were fading into the darkness around her. The silence was becoming unbearable, so I decided to start a conversation again, more to calm myself down than to actually get to know her. So, are you from around here? I asked, forcing a casual tone. She took a while to respond, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a murmur. Yes, I am. The short, direct answer didn't help at all. The tension in the car continued to grow, like a cord stretched to its limit. I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the same emptiness of the dark road, but something made me feel like I was being watched, even though there was no one else there. Have you been waiting for someone on that road for long? I ventured another question, trying not to sound suspicious. Emily remained silent for even longer this time, which made my stomach knot. Finally, she murmured, "For too long." The words came out slowly, as if they weighed on her tongue. And that's when I noticed the first strange thing. A sweet smell began to spread through the car. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but as we drove, it became stronger. It wasn't a common perfume. It was more like the smell of old, withered flowers, something that mixed with the air in a sickly way. I glanced sideways at Emily, trying to figure out if the smell was coming from her. But she remained still, her eyes still fixed on the horizon, as if seeing something I couldn't. My discomfort grew with each passing second. What was that smell? It wasn't something I'd ever smelled in the car before. I tried to open the window a little to let the air circulate, but when I did, I felt another strange thing. The temperature inside the car had dropped drastically. The night was already cold outside, but the interior of the car seemed to have frozen suddenly, as if all the heat had been sucked out. My fingers stiffened on the steering wheel, and a thin layer of mist began to form on the windshield, forcing me to turn on the defroster. This is ridiculous, I thought. It's just a change in the weather, nothing more. But the discomfort was palpable. The sensation of being watched grew, and the sweet smell seemed to become stronger, almost suffocating. Emily's silence didn't help. I tried once again to talk to her, hoping to dispel the strangeness. Where were you going before? Getting stuck there? She slowly turned her head toward me, and her eyes, which had previously seemed merely distant, now held a terrifying depth, as if something was behind them, watching back. I was going home, she replied, her voice devoid of emotion, as if the sentence had no meaning. Something inside me started screaming that this wasn't right. Nothing about this situation made sense. The smell, the cold, the way she spoke, as if she were repeating memorized responses, disconnected from the moment. Logic told me to stop the car and ask her to get out. It was what any rational person would do. But the truth was I couldn't. There was something more, something that kept me there, as if I were caught in an invisible web. The silence between us grew again, heavy and strange. It was then that I noticed something else. Despite the cold, Emily didn't seem to feel anything. She sat there, her hands in her lap, not reacting to the chilly air, not shivering, not rubbing her arms to warm up. It was as if the temperature didn't affect her. The sweet smell seemed to be embedded in the air now, making it hard, suffocating to breathe. With each passing second, my mind tried to find a logical explanation, but I failed at every turn. None of my previous experiences, none of the fears I thought I knew, compared to what I was feeling there on that road with that girl next to me. The silence returned once again, and with it came a sound that made my heart leap in my chest. A soft sound, like a whisper, that seemed to come from somewhere behind me. I quickly looked in the rearview mirror, feeling my pulse in my ears, and all I saw was the emptiness of the dark road. But the sound continued, a low, indistinct murmur, as if someone were saying words I couldn't understand. My entire body tensed, and I almost lost control of the steering wheel. You're hearing things, I thought. You're tired, that's all. But the creeping fear wouldn't leave me. The sensation that something else was in the car with me grew by the second. Emily, on the other hand, didn't seem to notice anything. She was completely oblivious to my agitation, sitting there with her blank stare, not moving. The discomfort was growing to an unbearable point, and my mind began to think of the only thing that seemed sensible at that moment. I needed to get rid of her. Emily, I began, hesitantly, trying to control the tension in my voice. Maybe it's better if I drop you off here at the next spot. I don't want you to be bothered by the long ride. She didn't respond immediately, and then very slowly, a small smile appeared on her lips, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. No, it's not far. We're almost there. Those words, spoken so casually, made me swallow hard. Almost where? I thought. A wave of dread hit me, and I realized that, no matter where we were going, I didn't want to get there. The silence in the car seemed to stretch on for an eternity until, finally, Emily broke the quiet with a soft, almost distant voice. Have you ever heard of Michael Thompson? I frowned. The name sounded familiar, but I wasn't sure from where. I slowly shook my head, keeping my eyes on the road. He was my brother, she continued, her voice slightly lower. He died here, on this road. A shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't just the story that bothered me, but the way she spoke, as if she were sharing something she had repeated many times, something deeply ingrained in her memory. It was a few years ago, she went on, almost as if she were reminiscing aloud. We were coming home late at night. The road was empty just like now. He was driving fast, too fast. I always told him to slow down, but Michael was stubborn. He liked the adrenaline. And that night, her voice broke for a moment, and silence filled the car once again. I could feel the weight of what she was about to say, but I hesitated to push her to continue. She broke the silence herself, her voice even lower. We never made it home. The car skidded on a curve and I couldn't get him out. He died before anyone could help us. That sweet smell seemed to intensify, and my stomach twisted into knots. There was something deeply disturbing about hearing that, as if the very air around us was becoming too dense, too heavy to breathe. Since that night, she continued, her voice now full of deep sadness, I've been stuck here. I can't move on with my life. No matter how hard I try, I always end up back on this road. It's like something keeps me here, along with him. The temperature inside the car seemed to have dropped even further, and my mind struggled to find an explanation. Stuck here? What did she mean by that? The discomfort in my chest was turning into a growing fear. I just want to leave, she whispered, almost as if she were talking to herself. But I can't. I tried to process what Emily had just told me. The road seemed darker, as if the shadows of the trees around us were closing in on the car, making the air heavier and the space suffocating. My mind was still searching for a rational explanation for everything, trying to deny the growing discomfort that was suffocating me when something unexpected happened. The radio, which I had turned off long ago, switched itself back on. The sound burst through the speakers, a thick, distorted static that made me jump in my seat. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that I felt the joints in my hands ache. The static was almost unbearable, echoing inside the car, but soon it began to transform. The static was replaced by music, a soft, melancholic melody that sounded like it came from another era. Slow violins, accompanied by a distant piano, like a morning song. The music brought a heavier weight to the atmosphere, as if each note was laden with sad memories, intensifying the discomfort that was already hanging in the air. The female voice singing was almost a lament, something that penetrated straight into the soul. I tried to turn off the radio, but the button wouldn't respond. I turned the dial several times, banged on the dashboard, but the music kept playing. There was no control. It was as if the car had decided to come to life on its own. What is happening? I murmured to myself, almost without voice. Emily didn't say anything. She just sat there, expressionless, staring at the road with that distant look, as if she already knew what was coming. That only added to the tension in my chest. The temperature inside the car kept dropping, and every breath I took seemed to produce a cloud of vapor. It didn't make sense. Outside, the night was already cold, but inside the car, it was freezing. I looked at the GPS, looking for a distraction, anything that could keep me focused on reality, but that's when I noticed something else disturbing. The screen, which normally showed the route, now displayed something completely different. Where the map had once been, there was now a single word, repeated multiple times across the screen. Go back. I blinked several times, thinking I was seeing things, but the letters continued to appear and disappear, as if the GPS were trying to warn me of something my mind still couldn't accept. A chill ran down my spine. The car kept moving forward, but the road seemed longer than it should have been. It was as if we were driving in circles, never reaching anywhere. The GPS no longer showed the path, only that cryptic, threatening message. My heart raced in my chest, and I knew that something was very wrong. I was no longer in control of the situation. What's going on? I asked, this time directly to Emily, trying not to let the panic show in my voice. She remained silent for a long moment before finally turning her face towards me. Her eyes, which had previously only seemed sad, now had something more. A strange glint, as if she knew something I hadn't realized yet. It's all connected to this place, she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. No one ever truly escapes. I swallowed hard, a growing sense of dread inside me. Everything around me was out of control. The radio, the GPS, the temperature. It was as if the road was closing in on us, trapping us. And then, the sound on the radio changed again. Now, instead of music, I began to hear a muffled voice. It wasn't a song, it was crying. A man's desperate crying, echoing through the speakers, mixed with the sound of something breaking, maybe glass. I couldn't understand what was happening, but the voice continued, and the louder it got, the tighter my chest felt. I looked at the GPS again. The screen was flashing quickly, and the message "Go back" had been replaced by a new, even more terrifying sequence of words. "He is here." My breathing quickened, and the reality of the situation finally began to set in. I was trapped in something I didn't understand. Something much bigger and much more dangerous than just a lost girl and an empty road. Something I never should have encountered. Who is here? My voice faltered as I asked. Emily didn't answer me. Her eyes were fixed on the road ahead, her breathing almost non-existent. I knew without a doubt that there was no turning back. Something was watching us, and now it was too late to escape. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. The radio, the GPS, the crying, and that sinister message flashing on the screen. He is here. I was immersed in something far beyond my comprehension, and for the first time I felt genuine, visceral fear. But what tormented me the most was the feeling that there was something more, something I was missing. As I drove, still tense, a distant memory began to surface in my mind. I recalled a conversation I overheard years ago, when I was younger, one random afternoon in a bar in town. The older folks were talking about a terrible accident that had happened on Old Cross Road, and although I hadn't paid much attention at the time, everything was now coming back with disturbing clarity. I remembered that the name Michael Thompson wasn't new to me. It had been mentioned in that conversation, along with his sister. At the time, they talked about how the tragedy had shaken the entire town. Michael Thompson had died in a horrible accident on that road, and his sister, well, no one knew exactly what had happened to her. There were rumors, but all the details were lost in speculation. Many said she disappeared after the accident, and that something dark surrounded the two of them. My chest grew heavy at the memory of those stories. Emily Thompson, the girl now sitting next to me, was part of that tragedy. That much was clear, but there was more. I began to wonder why all of this was happening to me. Why me? Why tonight? Why did everything suddenly seem connected? My thoughts drifted back to the bar and that conversation. Someone had mentioned that, at the time of the accident, I had worked in the same office as Michael Thompson. Although we had never met personally, we knew of each other. Perhaps unconsciously, the name had stayed in my mind for years. And now, here I was on the same road where he died, with his sister beside me. Everything was beginning to feel inevitable, as if I were destined to be here on this night. I swallowed hard. There was a personal connection to all this, a web of events leading me straight to this cursed road. It wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't coincidence. Somehow, everything was tied to me. "I know who you are, Emily," I murmured, without taking my eyes off the road, my heart pounding. "And I know about the accident." She didn't respond immediately, but I felt that something had changed. It was as if my realization had sparked something she had been waiting for me to understand. "You're not here by chance," she finally said. "And you're not alone either." Her words echoed inside me, and at that moment, everything became clear. I was part of the story, even though I had never realized it before. The silence after that sentence was almost deafening. The sound of the engine seemed distant, muffled by the revelation that had just fallen on me. Something inside me knew I could no longer ignore what was happening. The pieces were falling into place, one by one, revealing a puzzle I didn't know I had been solving. Then Emily, still not looking at me, finally began to speak. Her voice softer than before but laden with sadness. "I died that night, John." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but at the same time, I knew it was true. The sweet smell, the cold that filled the car, and her behavior. Everything pointed to what I feared but hadn't wanted to accept until now. "Michael and I were on our way home," she continued, her voice somber, almost as if she were forcing herself to relive the moment. He was driving too fast, as he always did, and on that curve, we lost control. The car flipped, and everything went dark. When I woke up, I saw my brother dead. I was there with him, trying to call for help, but no one came. I died that night, along with him, even though my body has stayed here, trapped. The lump in my throat tightened. How could she talk about her own death so calmly? It was impossible to process, but at the same time, something inside me told me that every word she spoke was true. "Why are you here now?" I asked, feeling the fear rising again. "Why with me?" She finally looked at me. Her eyes no longer held that glow of someone trapped in a world of sorrow. There was something else now, something much deeper, as if she were looking at me through layers of time and pain. "I need your help," she said, almost in a whisper. "I need you to take me to where the accident happened, to the place where everything ended. It's the only way I can finally find peace and leave this place forever." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the responsibility she had just placed on me. The idea of taking her to the site of the accident, revisiting the exact spot where she and her brother had died, filled me with dread. But at the same time, I knew there was no other choice. "What will happen when we get there?" I asked, trying to keep my fear in check. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice fragile. "But whatever happens, it will be the end. For me, and for Michael." Her brother's name echoed in the car, and with it came a new chill, the feeling that something was waiting for us in that place. Something I wasn't prepared to face. But somehow, I knew there was no turning back. I needed to help her finish what had started that night years ago. "All right?" I muttered, feeling the tension growing inside me. "I'll take you there." She just nodded, and I knew, at that moment, that the hardest part of the journey was only beginning. As the car began to approach the accident site, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't just the oppressive silence or the abnormal cold that had been accompanying us since Emily got into the car. It was something deeper, a sense that the very air around us had become dense, heavy. The engine, once reliable, seemed to struggle to keep going, as if it were being sucked into an invisible void. The trees, once still, now seemed to lean toward us, casting grotesque shadows under the headlights. For a moment, the road seemed endless. I knew we were almost there. The GPS, which had been displaying unsettling messages earlier, now showed what seemed like a final point, with no name, no road to follow. It was as if the device knew exactly where we needed to stop, even though that place didn't exist on any map. The car finally slowed down as we reached a particularly tight curve, surrounded by tall, dark trees. The asphalt there was more worn, cracked, as if time had been unforgiving to that stretch. This was the place. I could feel it. I pulled the car to the side of the road, the engine still softly rumbling as I took a deep breath. The accident site. I could almost hear the screams and the sound of metal twisting, even though everything around was enveloped in a terrifying silence. I looked over at Emily, but she no longer seemed the same. Her body was there, but there was something different about her, something almost ethereal. Her skin, once pale, now seemed translucent under the faint light of the dashboard. Her edges were blurred, as if she were slowly merging with the air around her. "This is it," she whispered, with a distant voice full of strange serenity. "This is where it all ended." There was a sad peace in her words, an acceptance that struck me deeply. Emily was no longer scared. There was no more desperation in her voice. It was as if, by finally arriving at this point, she had found something she had been searching for all along. Slowly, I turned off the engine. The silence that followed was almost tangible, so thick that it felt like the world had stopped around us. That sweet smell that had followed me since she entered the car was now stronger, almost unbearable, and the cold was so intense that my body trembled involuntarily. "What happens now?" My voice came out softer than I expected, almost as if I feared that any sound might shatter the fragility of the moment. Emily turned to me for the last time. Her eyes, once filled with pain and sorrow, now seemed calmer, as if the burden she had been carrying was finally being lifted. "Now I can go," she said, her tone gentle, almost like a whisper of gratitude. Gradually, the outline of her body began to fade, like mist blown away by the wind. She was disappearing, becoming part of the night that surrounded her. With every passing second, she grew more distant, more translucent. It was as if her very essence was dissolving before my eyes. "Thank you, John." Her voice, now almost inaudible, floated to me, bringing with it a strange sense of calm. I could never have done this alone. I wanted to say something, to respond, but the words failed me. The feeling of loss and relief mingled inside me as I watched the girl who had, somehow, become part of this journey slowly vanish into the void. In a matter of seconds, she was gone. The seat next to me, where Emily had been, was empty, as if it had never been occupied. The cold, the sweet smell, and the oppression around me began to dissipate, and the silence that remained was no longer threatening. It was a silence of peace, something I hadn't felt since I first entered that road. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight on my chest lighten a little, although I knew that nothing would be the same after that night. I didn't know exactly what had happened, nor why I had been chosen to help Emily, but one thing was certain. The road had released one of its prisoners, and I was the only one who had witnessed it. With trembling hands, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine responded with a soft growl, as if the road itself was now allowing me to move forward. The GPS, which had been flashing disturbing messages earlier, was now back to normal, displaying the route home. The road ahead of me was clear, but as I slowly accelerated, I glanced one last time in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the distance, a figure standing at the edge of the road, watching. But when I blinked, there was nothing. As I sped up to leave that place, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. Emily had gone, found her peace. The oppression that had accompanied me throughout the night seemed to finally be dissipating, and the road before me seemed, for the first time, normal. The car engine purred softly, and for a moment, I thought the ordeal was over. But as I continued along Old Cross Road, something caught my attention further ahead, making my stomach tighten again. Another figure, further down the road, at the edge of the street. My mind, still reeling from what had just happened, quickly went on alert. Another person, at this hour, here? It didn't make sense, and the thought of simply speeding up and driving past crossed my mind. But something made me slow down, as if an invisible force was pushing me to stop. I knew I wasn't alone on that road. As I got closer, I could see more clearly. It was an older woman, with gray hair tied in a tight bun, wearing simple, worn clothes, as if she were stuck in time. Her gaze was fixed on the road ahead, the same melancholic expression I had seen on Emily. She didn't raise her hand asking for help, didn't signal in any way. She just stood there, as if she knew I would stop. Against all the instincts telling me to move on, I pulled the car to the side of the road. The engine purred softly, almost like a beating heart, as I lowered the window and watched her for a moment. Something was wrong, but I knew I couldn't leave her there. "Are you okay, ma'am?" I asked, my voice laden with a weariness I could barely hide. The woman slowly turned her head towards me, her eyes revealing a deep, ancient sadness. She didn't respond immediately, as if she were struggling to find the words. "I knew you would come," she finally said, her voice hoarse but firm. Those words, spoken with such conviction, hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't the first time that night someone had said that to me, and my body immediately tensed. Her hands, visibly aged, clutched a worn bag, as if it were all she had left of her life. But her eyes, fixed on mine, revealed something deeper, a pain that transcended time. "Do you need help?" I asked hesitantly, already knowing that the situation wouldn't be that simple. She nodded slightly, but her gaze remained on the road, as if she were looking for something, or someone. "I am Michael and Emily's mother," she said, without preamble, her voice laden with unmistakable sadness. "I lost them that night. I lost everything. And since then, I've been here waiting for a chance to see them again." Her words hit me hard, and the knot in my stomach returned with full force. Emily had mentioned her brother, mentioned the accident, but she had never spoken about her mother. How could someone be trapped in a place like this for so long? The weight of her revelation fell on me in an overwhelming way. She was here, like Emily, trapped on that cursed road, wrapped in an endless wait for a resolution that never came. "You've been here all this time?" My voice was low, almost a whisper, as the gravity of the situation unfolded before me. She nodded again, her eyes lightly welling up, but without shedding a single tear. "When they died, a part of me died too. I stayed waiting, always waiting, in the hope that something or someone would bring them back. But I never found them. Until now." The weight of her words made me swallow hard. The road had trapped more than just Emily and Michael. She too was trapped. Suddenly, the entire night, with all its strange and supernatural occurrences, began to make more sense. It wasn't just an individual curse. It was a web binding the entire family to that accursed place. "I saw Emily," I murmured, breaking the thick silence that had formed. "She asked me to take her to the site of the accident. I think she's finally found peace." The woman's face lit up for a brief moment, and her eyes, which had been filled with pain, glimmered with a spark of hope. "Emily?" she whispered, as if she couldn't believe it. "She is free." I nodded slowly, still trying to understand how I fit into this strange chain of events. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, and I saw her shoulders relax, as if an unbearable weight had been lifted from her back. But there was something more, something unsaid. Before I could ask, she continued, "Michael, he's still here, isn't he?" My heart tightened in my chest. I didn't know. I hadn't seen Michael, but everything about that road indicated that he, somehow, remained present. The tension rose, the creeping fear returned. She had been waiting not just for Emily, but also for the son who still wandered the road. I don't know," I admitted, unable to offer any certainty. "But I feel like tonight was different." She sighed deeply, a sound tired, but at the same time, laden with a timid hope. "You brought them back to me, even if just for a moment. I can feel them. I think finally I can leave." And then, just like Emily, the woman began to change. Her body seemed to relax, as if the wait had finally ended. The aged face, marked by suffering, softened, and the same mist that had taken Emily began to envelop the woman. "Thank you," she whispered, her tone full of gratitude and sadness. "You don't know how long I've waited for this." I just remained silent, watching as she disappeared, the figure that had been so solid now slowly fading into the darkness of the road. I had freed her. The weight of that night, with all its revelations, was beginning to dissipate, but the road, that cursed road, seemed darker than ever. As I watched the figure of Emily and Michael's mother fade into the mist, a strange sense of peace began to spread through the air around me. The cold, which had seemed freezing, was starting to lessen. The oppression that had accompanied me since I first entered Old Cross Road seemed to be slowly lifting, as if the shadows that surrounded the road had finally decided to retreat. It was as if a great burden had been lifted from that place, an invisible weight that had hovered over everything for so long. The car, which had been surrounded by an eerie silence and an almost palpable discomfort, now felt more normal. The engine, still running, emitted a soft purr, as if the road had finally released its suffocating grip. I looked around and noticed that the trees, once threatening and twisted in the headlights, now seemed more natural, less distorted by the darkness. The mist began to clear, revealing a road that had, until then, seemed endless and full of secrets. I sat in the car for a few minutes, letting it all sink in. Something profound and supernatural had just happened, something I could barely begin to understand. I had helped free not just one lost soul, but 2 generations trapped in a cycle of suffering, bound to a road where time seemed to stand still. The road, which had seemed to imprison the pain of that family, was now changing, returning to what it should have been, just a road. Emily and Michael's mother had found peace, just like her daughter, and now, the air around me seemed to almost glow with serene stillness. It was as if the road was breathing again, freed from its burden, and I felt different. There was something inside me, a strange calm, a certainty that I had witnessed the conclusion of a very old story, something that, in some way, had chosen me to happen. I sighed deeply, feeling my body relax for the first time that night. The sense of imminent danger had disappeared. The wind, now gentler, rustled the leaves of the trees with a soothing whisper. The road was clear and, in a way, so was I. It was time to go home. I started the car, and this time the road seemed more open, as if it were giving me passage. Deep down, I knew that something mystical had just happened, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. And as I pressed the accelerator, leaving the accident site behind, I felt that, finally, Old Cross Road was at peace. The drive home was quiet. There were no more voices on the radio, no disturbing messages on the GPS. Just the sound of the engine and the asphalt passing beneath the tires. The city was still a few miles away, but everything seemed different now. It wasn't the road that had changed. It was me. The city lights finally appeared on the horizon, and I felt a wave of relief. I was back to reality, to the everyday world where things made sense. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that everything that had happened that night was just a series of strange and inexplicable events, something inside me had changed. I had always been a skeptic. Ghosts, curses, stories of trapped spirits. Those always seemed like the kind of things people make up to make sense of tragedies and mysteries that the rational mind can't solve. But what I experienced that night couldn't simply be ignored. It was real. I saw Emily and her mother disappear. I felt the presence of something beyond the reality I know. And somehow I was at the center of it. As I pulled into my neighborhood, I felt a calm that I hadn't expected. It was strange, but despite everything, there was peace within me. Peace that came from knowing that I had done something important. I wasn't a hero, far from it. I was just chosen for some reason I would never understand. The Thompson family's story, marked by sadness and tragedy, didn't belong to me, but I had been drawn into it. And, in some way, I helped close the cycle of pain that had kept them trapped. I pulled into the garage and turned off the car. The silence of the night felt much more comforting now. Something had ended, and I knew that deep in my being. I didn't know if I would ever tell anyone about what happened on that road, or if I would keep it all to myself. But one thing was certain: I would never be the same again. I grabbed my keys, got out of the car, and walked into the house. Each step felt lighter, as if a weight I didn't even know I was carrying had been lifted. The clock on the living room wall read nearly 3 in the morning, but I didn't feel tired. There was a strange serenity within me. Sitting on the couch, I stayed there for a few minutes in silence, reliving the moments of that night. The image of Emily fading into mist and her mother finally being set free lingered in my mind. And as I thought about it, a faint smile crept across my face. I had helped bring an old story to a close, something bigger than me, something that in some way needed me to happen. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel and check out the next story playing on the screen.